Hi, and welcome to episode 39 of the ChessTDD series. I am picking up from where I left off last time, having figured out something dumb that I was doing, but not having had enough time to actually implement the remainder of the bishop feature that I had started. So, what I'm going to do is start out getting rid of, or finishing up that feature, and then in the interim here, I'm getting rid of finally that dead method that I seem to always notice when it's red. I had recalled that, come back in here while green, and deleted it. So that's kind of the flip side of the lesson I've offered up at various points here, which is you don't want to do refactorings, even sort of straightforward ones, while you're red. You want to wait until you're green to do that. And I've seen and done various things over the course of time to keep track of stuff like that for later. One of the big ones that you see here that I use is typically I might throw that in my Trello board if I think of it. Problem is usually if I'm in there and it's red, I'm concentrating and in the flow of thinking, so sometimes that's a little more difficult. If you've got like sticky notes beside your desk or something, you might just like rip off a sticky and put it on your monitor or something just to remind you later when you're not concentrating that, hey, there was something you thought of before that that little bit of a teaser, so to speak, might be enough. So back to the task at hand. What I'm doing here is I am repeating the test that caused all the trouble, but over on the black side of the board where the black bishop is surrounded by white pieces, I want to make sure that I'm doing this correctly for coming back towards me, so to speak, on the board. Given the various bits of trouble that I've had over the course of this series with doing things both left to right and right to left, or front to back and back to front, trying to be a little bit better about making sure I'm testing things in as many different ways as possible. And there's another lesson for you to take away if you want, is that you kind of learn as you go and you'll flesh things out more. When it comes to creating tests of any sort, you, by the process of testing, start to understand a little bit more about what triggers your application to have things go wrong. You'll flail around a bit and then get kind of efficient. And then you might even want to, as I might do here, go back and flesh out some of these earlier features that I wrote. So as, what was I doing here? I guess referring to prior examples and then fleshing out the bishop and calling it a day on that one. So the next thing that I wanted to do is I shuffled the cards a little bit and I said, I'm going to come back here and revisit pawn and take a look at this this idea of the pawn being able to capture diagonally and move forward in direct, straight fashion. So to do that, it's been a while since I've looked at the pawn's movement. That's why I was kind of scrolling here through the feature just to see what I had already tested. And this, if you'll recall, was one of the really early spec flow features I implemented. So I was still doing this thing and where I maybe moved the pawn to where I wanted it, or put the pawn like one space from where I wanted it, then moved it. I think that might have been to trigger the pawn not being on its first move. Whereas if I had just placed it on space 8 there, it might have created a bizarre situation. I don't really recall off the top. I suppose I could go back and look. But what I'm going to do is just come back in and write tests for the things about which I'm not sure. So I think the first thing I wanted to do is, and I'll know in a sec as I watch what happened here. At this point, I actually recorded the coding portion of this maybe 3 or 4 days ago, so it's not as fresh in my mind. But I think I wanted to see what happened with a blocked pawn. So I just started this out as if the white pawn were in its initial spot and the black pawn had advanced all the way to being in front of it. So right now, this particular pawn, this white pawn, should not have any moves. So before I get started adding this new capability for diagonal movement into the mix, I want to see if it's behaving as I would expect. And as I suspected, it is not. So this is actually saying that I have a move, which is that I could capture the black pawn, and that's not right. And the reason for this is that I haven't, not only have I not implemented diagonal capture, but I haven't implemented sort of the converse, which is that I cannot capture with a pawn going straight. So I want to get those ducks in a row first before I add new functionality. So what I'm going to do here, and I spent a little bit of time going back and refamiliarizing myself with this implementation, because as I said earlier, it's been a while since looking at pawn any amount of detail. So here's the implementation. Get moves from is fairly obtuse. I'm going to return a move that's one ahead, and then if that first move flag is, or if the has moved flag is false, I'm also going to return that second move. So this presented me with an interesting design consideration, and I went with something that was reasonable enough to me. I wasn't necessarily blown away by its elegance or anything. But one of the real benefits here, the things to learn about this test-driven development approach, is with all the coverage and the kind of consistent moving, you can go with something that you think is okay with the knowledge that it's generally going to be fairly easy to revisit and refactor later if you think of something better. So it prevents this kind of coder's block concept. So I looked around a bit here, came up with something that I thought would be workable, and then just kind of decided to run with it. And if memory serves, what I in essence wanted to do was, so here's the conundrum. From a dependency management perspective, the pieces know nothing about the board. The pieces understand what their own movement capabilities are, and that's it. And then the board understands where all the different pieces are. So what I've done is I've kind of set this up, rightly or wrongly, for the dependencies to flow in such a way that the pieces are not going to know anything about the board. And for my purposes here, that creates sort of a difficulty. So if I ask the pawn, hey, what are your legal moves? The pawn answer is something like, well, I can move ahead 1, or I can move ahead 2 if I haven't moved yet. That's all sort of constrained within the pawn. But now there's this difficulty of, well, I can move ahead, but only if I'm not blocked. So how do I express that given this paradigm that I've set up here so far? So the way I conceived of initially to do that without violating these constraints, I don't want pawn to have to know anything about what's going on the board. So I started to think about, how can I express maybe different sorts of moves, like special moves or, capture moves or non-capture moves. And if memory serves, we'll see how this bears out. But I think what I settled on was something like, let's define this idea that a piece can have capture validity or non-capture validity as a concept. So when I'm looking at whether a move is legal or not, I also then want to inquire from the pieces in question, hey, piece, is this particular move a legal capture move for you? And is this particular move a legal non-capture move for you? So we'll see that kind of bear out here. And this took a little, again, I'm doing all this in real time as I'm thinking of this. So this isn't me taking snippets where I've kind of sat there contemplating for a while. I'm just sort of examining things and coding them up on the fly. So in order to make this happen, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm defining like, okay, well, what does it mean for this to be a capture move? So it's a capture move if there's a piece at the destination is the first thing I thought. But, why am I getting an error here? And then I realized that I've got to do this, is the coordinate valid for board size check, because get piece is just being dumb and getting whatever destination there is there. And is move legal has been encapsulating this idea of, are we going out of bounds of the board? So in this method, as I make it more complicated, I need to first check if it's valid for board size before I start doing anything else, because some of these other methods have the assumption that I've already checked for board size validity. So is capture, is this local variable where I'm saying, and I think this is fairly readable, is the coordinate valid for the board size, and then is there a piece at the destination? So is this valid, and does destination have a piece? If destination has a piece, then it's going to be a capture move. Although in retrospect here, I might try to tease out a way to test, because I am only looking to see if there's a piece at the point of capture. So I probably need this concept of friendly piece later, and I haven't done this yet, even in the next episode of coding. I'm just figuring this out as I'm looking. I should probably be checking for, friendly versus enemy piece as the second thing after valid for board size, and not just assuming that anything with a piece at the destination is a capture. Nothing went red, so I guess it's working, but as I go through this, I think I even put a card up on the Trello board that this needs to be revisited. And maybe as this is move legal becomes more complex, factored out to its own class. Because move legality with this new stuff going on with pawn is starting to become fairly complicated. So back to the coding at hand, what I was doing here is flailing around a little bit. I had some better ideas for how to implement this without the early return, but I figured I'd err on the side of clarity in my own mind first before refactoring to a slightly cleaner method. Okay, so now what I'm doing here is I define that method that I want, and this is a lesson to take away. It's something I think I was doing more earlier when there was more design thrash, which is that when I'm doing design activities, I start to think about, okay, if I had this magic oracle on this particular class, which is a method that just did what I want, let me define that and write the method or work on the method that I'm in, define this method on another class that does this magical thing I want, and work through the current method, and then go and implement the magical thing. It's a good way of dividing things up. So here I'm defining this is capture allowed at move with a destination coordinate. That's like the magical thing I wanted to do. And I just put in return true to get it to compile, because you want to, when you're doing TDD and you have non-compile, you want to get from non-compile to compile as quickly as possible. Leaving things in a non-compiling state is not good. So I was returning something to get it to compile, and I think true is what I want the default to be. Now in pawn, I'm going to override the is capture allowed at default behavior. For piece in general, we just want that to be true, because that's how the application has behaved up to this point. We're introducing this new Boolean condition and anding it. So to preserve all the prior unit test and acceptance test behavior, the new Boolean condition should default to true, because that's what life was like before. And now in this special case, to get this test that I've just recently written to green, I'm going to add this override where I'm returning false, and that's going to work. So I think this is, I wanted to make a note here. The suggestion I'd gotten a bunch of episodes ago now from Steve Smith about the context-based test naming scheme. Now that I'm going back and changing some of these older unit tests, it's chafing at me a little that I have these two different schemes. So I'm also starting to think about this now in terms of like if this were actual product development. This series has been going on for like a year or something. It's kind of crazy to think, but that's what's been happening. It's time to ship something, So I'm starting to deprioritize a little bit of the more tech-daddy stuff or the more nitpicky stuff, like if I had customers out there, they're going to want a product and I might be losing potential market share or something. I don't want to lose market share while I start to fuss about like how the unit tests are structured. That's not a good decision for a product owner to make. So I'm actually starting to emulate the idea of delivery crunch here a little bit and saying, I have these categories of things that I might do, but I want to get a shippable product where things are right, and then maybe pay down some of that tech debt. And another thing you might take away is that when you're using the TDD approach and the ATDD approach and you're getting a lot of test coverage, you can afford in some ways to let a little bit, I'm pickier than your average person would be about tech debt, but if you have good coverage, you can afford to float a little bit of tech debt out there, whereas you might not with no test coverage. Because there's never going to be a point where I'm terrified of changing these these production methods. So if I'm not entirely satisfied with a method at the moment, that's fine. It's easy for me to change a method at any point in time. If you're writing big, large methods that are legacy code with global variables, the moment you write them, you better get that right before you ever ship it, because you're never going to want to touch that thing again. So in a way, it's easier for me to be a little bit faster and looser with what I might think of as tech debt. So anyway, coming back to the test at hand, what I'm doing here is I want to drill in. I'd written that that dumb return false thing to get my acceptance test to pass. And now that that's passing, I want to sort of go back down to the granularity of the unit test level to start figuring out this behavior for this is capture allowed, at least for pawn. Right now it's doing something dumb, so I'm saying, okay, in the situation that was driven by that acceptance test, I needed that method to return false. But I don't just want to go, this is a little more of a nuanced behavior, so I want a little bit faster feedback. I want to flesh this out at the unit level. It's going to be a matter of preference for you as you kind of bounce back and forth between acceptance test-driven development and test-driven development. When do you do which is sort of an acquired taste, I guess, or that's not the word I'm looking for. It's a personal preference. I mean, you're going to discover how you best work. Now, as we go, getting back to the task at hand, one of the things I discovered is, given this implementation I had, as I shake off the rust from not remembering what I was doing, there's no state. So because the piece doesn't know anything about board, I was just passing in the destination to the piece. But because we don't know anything about board, the piece needs to know both starting coordinate and destination. So I am driving out a new version of is capture allowed here from my unit test, where instead of just taking one board coordinate, it's going to take two. And because that's failing to compile, I need to add this in. I'm going to call it origin, and I'm going to go back to the naming scheme of origin destination. Now, because this is inheritance, I believe this will not be compiling, so I'm going to have to go back up to piece, alter the method. That's going to cause the acceptance test not to compile. So even with chains of things like this, I rely on the test-driven development process to flesh out and lean on the compiler. I don't want to go around figuring out every place I need to change this. I just break it and then let the compiler tell me what's broken. Okay, so with all of that in place and then my rename, everything should be compiling. I think I'm going to see those ncrunch dots go back to green, or maybe I need to do a rename. Right. There we go. Once I get it squared away, there you see the dark green dots. So now I can actually start to make this method behave reasonably. So when the square in front of the pawn is blocked, I'm now capturing that in a unit test as well. But I want to say, I want to not be dumb about this. Like this new method now, I don't want it to return. Right now it's just saying false for everything. But in reality, I want this to return true for a diagonal move of the pawn, which is the new functionality that I'm starting to tease at here. I don't know exactly at this point what it will do in terms of acceptance test-driven development scenarios just yet. But what I do know is that right now that method just returns false, which effectively says the pawn can never capture anything, and I know that's not true. So at the unit level, I want to fix this method. And I'm going to do a little bit of this tighter feedback loop back and forth to get it behaving at the unit level the way I want. And again, this is just kind of my own personal preference for bouncing back and forth between the unit tests and the acceptance tests. But once I start to feel kind of good about what this method is doing at the micro level, it's at that point that I'm going to go back and say, oh, okay, I think I've got it now, so let me write an acceptance test that advances this scenario a little further. And this is sort of specific. When I talk about acceptance test-driven development, you might be objecting and saying, like, well, I'm driving this back from the unit level. But the initial sort of foray into functionality I drove from the acceptance level. Maybe I'm not right for that. Maybe there isn't right and wrong. That's just how I like to think about it. And it varies for me. And to tell you the truth, I don't have a particularly fixed set of ways that I approach everything. For better or for worse, I'm kind of constantly varying up what I'm doing in a never-ending search for improvement. So if you're in the kind of advanced beginner stage of things where you just want to practice the same technique over and over again, I might not always be the best person to watch. You could pick a set of things that I do and just kind of stick with those and practice. But I'm highly experimental in everything I do. I think it's how I prevent myself from getting bored. I don't know. This isn't dime store psychology time. So anyway, back to the task at hand. The thing that I'm doing, and this is the TDD simplest to get it passing premise, this is not a good implementation for pawn of whether capture is allowed or not. But it's going to get me to green, I think. There we go. So right now, what I'm testing to see is, are we on the same x coordinate? So that's an obtuse-ish implementation, but that gets me to the point where I'm getting the tests to do what I need them to. So the pawn is not allowed to capture straight ahead, but it is allowed to capture to the right one. So now I know the next test that I can write, which is to do... my apologies. I was forgetting what I did exactly. So I was testing for some oblique thing. There I wanted to test that I couldn't just do anything. So I said, hey, is this moving over one? And that'll get that oblique one to pass. So on the next episode, 40, is where I get a little less dumb about this. My apologies for the false start on narration, but I am trying to be a lot more respectful of time here, and I was getting to about 20 or 22 minutes, it looks like. So I'll have to get a little bit better for next time. But yeah, I was zeroing in on this approach, so I want to get it to where I can capture, and then I wanted to get another one where I couldn't capture, and then I'm going to finish it up with, I think, one over to the left, if memory serves. So I'll just commit here to... source, and then push it on up to GitHub so you can grab this if you want. And I will see you next time for episode 40.